Welcome everyone to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. My name is Herman Calderon. We'll get started in a couple of minutes as we wait for the room to fill, so just hang tight. We'll get started at about 12:03, and I'll keep repeating the message a little just as more people are coming in. Hello everyone, welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in 2 minutes at 12:03, just waiting for the room to fill a little. Just feel free, hang tight, introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. We'll get started shortly. Thank you. Hey everyone, thank you for joining the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill a little, so we're going to get started in a bit. Hang tight, introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. Just keep repeating the message a couple more times until the room fills. Thank you. Welcome everyone to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. We're just waiting for the room to fill a little, waiting for folks to get in. We'll get started shortly. Thank you for waiting. Thank you everyone for joining. We're going to get started in about 1 minute, so just hang tight. We'll get started shortly. Just waiting for the room to fill. Okay, it's 12:03, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining our Intro to Tech Equity webinar. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity, and I get to engage with our supporters through events, volunteer opportunities, campaigns we participate in, and now I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A box as we go, but we won't answer any of those questions until the end. The webinar is also going to be recorded, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email afterwards with a link to the recording and a link to the slides in case you all miss anything or you want to share that out to other people. It is being recorded. So a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. We'll cover why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address our most pressing economic issues. But first, let's talk about why we're here. So TechEquity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods and understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers were the cause of the problem. So they noticed things such as rising rents, displacement, increases in traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in these concerns and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help contribute to some of the solutions to the inequities that we're seeing in their neighborhoods. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on low-income people and communities of color. Many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. And at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate inequality that our region was already experiencing. Because of our affordability crisis, community members are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them in terms of housing, job security, etc. But I also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and have brought forth lots of success for themselves and their families alike. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame for our region's issues, it starts to create us versus them dynamics that's further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide. So while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal caused by the pandemic, it's important to note that many within the tech sector, as I mentioned previously, have remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. We have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. The fact that rents are rising, I don't think is a surprise to anyone on this call because we all know, we feel this, we've heard about this from friends and family here in the Bay Area. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. So we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as an organization, and it's also where tech is headquartered. But a version of this story is playing out all across the country. And it really is a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success, and without tech at the table to work together to address this shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. And just before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked to 16%, which was a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So in the span of a month, we lost about a decade's worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. However, at TechEquity, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities. And we have to show up, and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At TechEquity Collaborative, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar and getting to learn a little bit more about economic justice issues that you can participate and try to help find solutions for. Our goal is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. So we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. Our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do this in a variety of ways, such as book clubs, panel discussions with experts, webinars such as these, voter guides that we produce around election season, just different ways to educate people. We advocate for public policy that rebalances and builds economic equity. And a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which extends protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. So that was a bill that, together with community members, community organizations, legislators, a really big coalition, worked together on to help bring stronger protections to those most in need. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community. And we do this through corporate partnerships and engagements that we work on with companies. Tech workers have an outsized political power that has largely been untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy, more ethical practice in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At Tech Equity Collaborative, our two key issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in many ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. Our goal at Tech Equity is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. While the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity and the history of inequity within our neighborhoods. The affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain that our community is feeling, especially now during the pandemic. In the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and all across the country, and that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined, as we can see with the image on the screen of redlined neighborhoods in San Francisco. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redlined didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color. And that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. The crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. Like we talked about, it extends across California and across the country. So these are examples of redlined neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta. And once again, everything you see in red, those are communities that have historically been redlined. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from accessing capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who have lived in redlined neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be anything from a huge rent increase, a sudden loss of a job, your car breaks down, just huge random bills that come out of nowhere. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty, and 63% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is all happening, but many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing, and wages that don't cover the cost of living have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic. Many people in our communities were already struggling. And as the pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, Many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. As we can see, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much in the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. So this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for better pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And while all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. While there's a gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a gap between race. White men are earning more cents to the dollar, that's that orange bar on the left side of your screen, in comparison to Black men and women, the two blue bars on the right side of your screen. And because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in cities that are providing good jobs. So the cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. If you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom working a regular 8-hour day, regular shift. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. Again, that's 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom working minimum wage. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up an impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in cities with good jobs. And the problem persists across the country. Even though the costs in burgeoning tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high as San Francisco and the Bay Area, cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers, who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment. But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply, and this chart is showing us what we should be building. The state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA goals, and it stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. So that's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the smaller bars, the red ones on the left side of the screen. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember, when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities at higher rates while high income folks are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower income brackets, so the orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI which is that last bar at the end, are in a more drastic situation where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco as they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's why that last blue bar is actually increasing. There just isn't enough affordable housing available to support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are equally tragic. As we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at higher rates. Furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. A combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, and a lack of affordable housing production have created a crisis of displacement. So displacement really is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. The folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. The good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working alongside non-tech community members. Together, we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve it without the necessary policy change. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and it starts with production. So building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing lengthy delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build homes. Preservation, making sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the necessary housing that we need. But in the meantime, we need to make sure that we're protecting existing tenants from displacement. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that build racial equity in response. Especially now, we need to be thinking about short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors are more at risk than ever as a result of the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages regardless of the role. We need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse workers, and contracted workers. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, in making sure that the workplace is safe and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. Training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of inequality, and it will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. In order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies: massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large. not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. We must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved. We host tons of educational events, so you can keep an eye out for upcoming panel discussions we'll have on our webpage. If you're interested in public policy, you can support our Contract Worker Disparity Project, which is a project around supporting fellow contracted workers at your companies. So if you're interested about that, hit me up in the follow-up email. For corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So also you can reply to this email. We'll connect you to our corporate partnerships manager. We also offer a variety of different volunteer opportunities, such as civic tech projects, where if you're an engineer, you can donate some of your time and your skills to some projects we have going on. So this is how we work at TechEquity Collaborative. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, but building community in the process as well. And this year, we're excited to continue our work in the housing and labor spaces through creating ethical workplaces in tech, tackling algorithmic bias in housing that's further driving inequality and upholding systemic racism in the housing market, and crucial housing policies that are protecting and bringing relief to our most vulnerable communities. So what can you do today? You can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can support us financially by becoming a member for $10 a month, or you can take action with us. As I mentioned, we have tons of volunteer opportunities, whether you want to be a civic tech volunteer, you want to support our efforts on the Contract Worker Disparity Project, there's tons of ways for you to get involved. And if you're not sure, like I said, just send me an email afterwards, replying to that follow-up email. But I did want to talk about some of our priority legislation that we worked on this year. So TechEquity is committed to getting better data about our housing market, and better data means that we can build more accurate policy interventions and ensure that help is being targeted to people who need it the most. So TechEquity is working on a number of campaigns to get better data on housing and ensure that data is being used fairly through our rent registry and algorithmic bias in housing initiatives. So this year we were able to run a bill, AB 1188, that unfortunately stalled out of the legislative process this year, but we plan to continue to pursue establishing a rental registry. And just make sure you subscribe to our newsletter. You can join our Slack and you can stay updated on this. We also supported legislation that relates to our core issues of housing and workforce and labor. So this year we decided to focus our advocacy on these bills that you see on the screen because they would have the most to ensure an affordable home, a family sustaining job, and a true safety net is available for all Californians. So if you'd like more information on these bills and whether or not they passed, I'll be including links to these, to our priority legislation page, and to a blog where we rounded up what passed, what didn't, and a little short summary of what those bills were. So like I talked about, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, you can become a member for $10 a month, or you can take action with us by volunteering either on a campaign, on a project, or as a civic tech person. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So now is the time for questions. If you have any questions, please drop those into the chat. As I mentioned, the webinar was recorded, so you'll be receiving a follow-up email with the recording. You'll be receiving the slides as well, and then I'll include links to some of the things that we talked about today. So I'll just wait a couple of minutes. You can also ask questions on a one-on-one basis, so replying to that follow-up email, and I can get back to you as soon as possible. I'll just take a minute, see if there are any questions. Cool. So I'm not seeing any questions. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to just hear about economic justice issues, learn a little bit about tech equity and maybe how you'd like to get involved. Keep an eye out on that follow-up email. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to talk to folks on a one-on-one basis as well. And just thank you so much for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.